Welcome to Formed, where each week we navigate a relevant topic or question through honest conversations. We are three pastors with three different backgrounds on staff together at Irving Bible Church in Irving, Texas. We believe we are constantly being formed in the way of Jesus for the sake of the world, and we hope this podcast helps with that. So let's jump into this week's episode of Formed. Welcome back to another week of Formed, and we're post-Super Bowl.
Here we are, post-Super Bowl.
It's happened.
We survived. I didn't
You
watch a single play of that football game.
Oh, my gosh.
Really? I didn't
watched
know
the
that.
halftime show. I was making my chili. My warm
Here we
chili.
go. Chili King.
Oh, did
Chili King.
Barry just figure out a way
yeah,
to
he
work
worked
the
it in.
cook-off
He
right
worked
here
it
at the
in.
beginning?
We had our staff chili cook-off,
We did.
and Barry won again.
But not one. He won by a landslide.
Yeah.
We have, it was a great chili.
And Barry wants you to know that it was a brand new recipe, too.
Yeah.
Well,
This by far, I think, was your best chili. I told you that.
It turned out pretty well.
It was really
Thing
good.
is, there's no actual recipe.
That is true. You're just throwing stuff.
Throw stuff in a pot and keep tasting and adding and stirring and.
But you purposely
So
changed it up this year.
I purposely changed it up because I figured people would be looking and going, "That one's Barry's. I'm not voting for that one." So it had to be unrecognizably Barry's.
Yeah.
Barb was texting me during it and was like, "Oh, this chili's okay. This chili, Barry's is incredible."
I was like, who made that? And I was like, I'm pretty sure that's Barry's because there's so many ingredients.
I didn't mean to Anyway, it was fun. We had a good time. I got a large ring. Yeah.
So you may not have watched the Super Bowl, but you were wearing an almost Super Bowl ring.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, or you
I am
own
now.
one at least.
I am now.
Now your hardware's
So-
stacking up for
Oh,
the chili
he's out of control. He's going to show up on Sunday morning with all this one day.
Thanks for the nations. Barry's just going to bring a chili to it this year. So, in regards to the Super Bowl, I think, something that's changed so much over the years, it feels like what seemed like a kind of like a secret thing, maybe even when I was younger, was sports gambling. And now it dominates everything. I mean, there's so many ads. There's so many. Now the sports networks, it was almost like voodoo back in the day to even you couldn't even mention it. And just hearing even players talk about it, it's like you couldn't even talk about gambling.
Acknowledge that it existed. Yeah.
And now it's like you're watching
Very
a game
normal.
and it pops up on the side of the screen. Here's the prop bet, or here's the probability of this happening. And if you put down, here's the odds on it. And it's just everywhere you turn now in sports, just in the subject of sports, you see gambling
it's huge.
so prominent. And I had this stat and was talking about the Super Bowl. According to American Gaming Association, nearly 68 million Americans are expected to wager on the game, betting a record-breaking $23.1 billion. That's a B, as in
That's
boy.
crazy.
$23.1 billion.
Yeah. I was blown away by that.
I know. It's just so, I feel like this is one of these topics too when it comes to being a Christian, being a believer, and gambling as a broad topic, not even just sports gambling. So let's just start with the big question. Let's just get this one out of the way. Is it okay for Christians to gamble?
So a really important question and lots of nuances to it that we'll explore through the whole episode. But I think the first thing we say right out front is, look, there's not even though we might want there to be, there's not a hard and fast rule. We don't have chapter and verse in the scriptures to point to and go, this is right, this is wrong. That, like we've talked about before, so often following Jesus isn't about following rules, right? It is about cultivating Christ-like wisdom and virtue. And so we really have to talk about wisdom and virtue when it comes to gambling rather than right or wrong, rather than a rule. Because a rule, then we'd still struggle with how do we apply it. When you go to the carnival and you do the ring toss, right? You lay down your $3 and toss the ring in hopes of winning the big, stuffed animal. Does that constitute gambling? We don't typically find that sort of morally objectionable. And so where is the line if it's a hard and fast rule? The stock market, right? You put down your money, oftentimes much larger sums, in hopes that it's going to go up, in hopes that it doesn't go down. It's kind of a game of chance. There's certainly some kind of science to it, but it's kind of a game of chance. Like, but we don't typically find that morally objectionable.
Our
so
staff fantasy
where is
football league.
there you go, right?
Yeah.
Where is the line if we're talking about hard and fast rule? It's hard to determine. Rather, what we have to do is talk about how do we cultivate Christ-like wisdom and virtue in order to navigate the complexities of this in ways that, you can engage in a friendly wager that's really a kind of form of entertainment where the stakes are really low. But then we can also just recognize there's ways in which this practice can be incredibly destructive. And I think that we're seeing that more and more, even as you have the explosion, particularly what the internet makes possible. You're now seeing more and more the ways in which this can be devastating. And so, I don't know, to me, the first thing we have to kind of set up is, even though we might like there to be a hard and fast rule, we don't have that. We have to talk about how do we apply Christ-like wisdom and virtue? How do we engage this with a certain appropriate kind of caution, recognizing the way in which something that can sort of start out as a kind of harmless fun can actually turn into something that's really, really harmful.
Yeah, and I mean, I totally agree with that. I think it's, we'd want there to be a simple yes or no, and there's far more nuance involved in that. And it's thinking about how do we take biblical principles and apply that so that we might live wisely. And I think the other part of this is we want to focus on a outward behavior, like just stop this bad habit, whatever it is, gambling or whatever it is. But Jesus points us to the internal motivations of our hearts.
good.
Right? And that's where I think you need to determine, is this a life-giving thing? Does this lead me to stir my affections and love for Christ? Or is this something that I need to stay away from because of what's happening inside of my heart? Is it causing me, the love of money, is it causing me to chase after greed or an unhealthy desire for wealth? Or is it causing me to chase after God? Am I looking to this, putting my trust in this, rather than putting my trust in God and thinking about, am I stewarding finances well?
That's good.
Yeah, all of that.
We've talked about the whole idea from John Calvin talks about the idea the human heart as a perpetual idol-making factory, right? Yeah. We're constantly producing these idols of the heart. And this is one of those things that can very much become a kind of idol of the heart. It can connect back to that that desire for greed, that inordinate attachment to wealth, and so that need for the kind of dopamine hit that comes with, you pull the lever and you see the winnings, and there's a whole sort of neurobiological thing that happens inside of you that is part of the way even some of the games are designed to operate in a way that can pull you in and can create compulsive and addictive behaviors.
Is there an example in the Bible that you're like, oh, this one, this talks about or could be used in regards to gambling, or do we see gambling anywhere in Scripture?
So I don't think you specifically see gambling in Scripture. I think a lot of times people point to, and I think this is stretching it, the casting of lots as, well, that's gambling. And, I think about gambling, and I thought about this a lot this morning, there's really three components, right? There's this game of chance that has a certain outcome. There's a wager that you place, and then there's some kind of prize that comes out of it based on the wager. And so you don't see that specifically. You do see the casting of lots, but that's more of, it's kind of like flipping a coin. It's chance-based decision-making. And so you see that throughout Old Testament and New Testament where when, God commands them to use that for discerning between the scapegoat and the sacrificial goat. Joshua uses it for the allotment of land for the tribes. You see it at the foot of the cross, right? The soldiers cast lots to determine who's going to get Jesus' garment. And so, but I wouldn't necessarily say that's gambling.
Yeah. Again, I think that, ditto to everything that Sissy says. We don't see that a practice. We don't see a specific reference to it.
Principles.
We then do get these kind of biblical references to things like greed, to things like good financial stewardship. So there's practices that have similar analogies and yet are different in some important ways. And then we have kind of biblical principles that we can reach for to apply as we're seeking to cultivate that sense of Christ-like wisdom and virtue.
So we might not see examples in the Bible, but you have your examples in Vegas.
That was a subtle
subtle?
transition.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mentioned this story before we started recording, and I suppose now I have to tell it publicly. Yeah, so I mean, my grandparents grew up, going to Vegas every year at Thanksgiving, and so this is part of, kind of some of my backstory. I traveled with them all the time as a kid, but that was the one trip that I didn't get to go on with them. And I think my grandparents were examples of people that were able to go, engage this as purely a form of entertainment. There wasn't some compulsion that, they were going with the expectation, hey, we're going to lose money on this, but we're going to have fun doing it, right? And so they enjoyed it, but they had always told me, when you turn 21, we'll take you with us. And so my grandfather passed away when I was 15. I turned 21. My grandmother says, hey, let's go to Vegas. And so here I am, a 21-year-old me in Vegas with my grandmother, and I'd been saving up quarters in a jar. I took them out in a big Ziploc bag. Just to have fun on slot machines or roulette or whatever, and so we got there, and if you've ever flown into the Vegas airport, there's slot machines in the airport, and so my grandmother sits down to start playing as soon as we get to the airport, and somebody stole her purse. And so all the money that we had for the trip, she had in traveler's checks that were all in her purse. So everything's gone. The night that we arrive. Yeah. And so we go and check into the hotel, and what are we going to do? Thankfully, because she had so much in traveler's checks, she's going to be able to get those reimbursed. She's got the numbers. So she didn't actually lose a lot of money, but we didn't have anything to play with that night except my big Ziploc bag of quarters. And so my grandmother and I are going down and playing the quarters out of my Ziploc bag. So, it was purely a kind of form of entertainment. Yeah. I knew I was going to lose money. And that also I know, even from that first experience of okay, I can see how this can actually develop compulsive behavior. And so that's even part of my own recognition of you got to really have wisdom when it comes to engaging this. This isn't something that just is sort of merely harmless fun. I grew up, as a kid in the 80s, when video game arcades exploded. And we would go feed those machines for hours with actually no hope for any kind of financial return. And so we're throwing our money away. And you can engage the slot machine in the same way, and yet when you do get that payoff, there's something that happens that you can wind up getting sucked into that in ways that are, again, like I said before, can easily lead to compulsive or addictive behavior. So even telling my story about my trip with my grandmother, I don't want to make it sound as though this is sort of merely a plaything that we can trifle with. This is serious stuff. And even that first experience
kind of
taught me how, I can see how somebody could easily find themselves in a hole and convinced that they can figure out how to get out of it, and pulled into some destructive kind of patterns, behaviors.
When we were in our Barb and I in our early 20s, it was the first year we were married, and there's a river boat across the river in Indiana because it's not legal in Kentucky, and it has casino in it. So we went. One year is, I don't know, some holiday or something. And we went in, we're $50. We're just going to have fun with it. And, we sat down there and, spent our $50. And then on the last, one of the last, pulls on something, we won $40 back. And we're like, oh, cool, we only lost $10. But I'll never forget walking in there. It was my first experience in any type of casino. And I seen people just sitting there with their debit or cards in, and I seen this lady that had sitting in between two machines, two cards in, alternating,
totally normal.
Alternating the pulls, and I was like, this is much deeper than and so why is gambling so much more than just the financial part?
Yeah, I mean, again, it gets back to, it's not just this outward behavior or bad habit. It's about what's going on in your heart, right? So what are you looking to provide you that joy, that comfort, that satisfaction, that security. And the problem with gambling is it can turn into this addictive, compulsive, unhealthy relationship that, because of the dopamine hit, because of it leads to this mood altering behavior that has harmful consequences, not even just for you, but for oftentimes for people around you. That can lead you to your loyalty and your love and your allegiance to stir that, to take that away from God and towards the love of money and this, if I keep doing this, I'll feel better, kind of idea. And I think that's where that sort of idea of addiction comes from. And so I think you have to be so careful, because there is a sense in which it can be fun and harmless and purely for recreation, and then there's this line that you can cross where it can become so much more, where it takes a hold of your life in a way that only God should have a hold of your life. So I think it's not just about, it is certainly about how to use money wisely and all of that, but it's also about what really has allegiance of your heart.
Yeah. I've heard the idea of the way in which addictive behaviors sort of emerge, and then how we overcome addiction in terms of giving up everything for one thing versus giving up one thing for everything, right? And you think about that, like, so oftentimes when you get pulled into addictive behaviors, and gambling, it can become so easily for many, that sense of an addictive behavior, because of the kind of rewards that come, both the sort of neurochemical thing that we've alluded to. I'm no expert in any of that, and yet it's a very real part of what happens in this, as well as the financial rewards, and then there's sort of the social kind of connection. But those rewards can be then what sort of pulls you into this addictive behavior, to the point now you're making significant sacrifices in terms of finances, in terms of the ways in which this impacts negatively in relationships and even one's own mental health, right? The ways in which you wind up giving up everything for that one thing, versus the journey of recovery is giving up that one thing for everything else, right? The rest of my life is so important. Our family's financial stability, my relationships, my mental health, my spiritual life, all of that. I want to choose that over this thing that I've become addicted to. And so, yeah, I think that there's just a recognition. It's not just about the exchange of money. There's a whole another layer that really is about psychology and about spirituality, that is underneath all of that.
Why do you think churches sometimes shy away from talking about gambling?
To me, I think there's maybe a couple of things at play. One is the church in the past, historically, especially I think I think about the American church, has tended to be known for what it stands against, right? And we've always tried to be a church that's more about what we're for than a church that's just about sort of shaking a finger and denouncing the world. And so I think more and more churches these days are trying not to be the shake your finger at the world kinds of churches, but we can actually wind up being naive then if we think it's about what's happening out there in the world and not recognize the way in which, no, this is about something out there. It's about something in here. It's about what's happening in our own lives, especially, again, as we talked about, the proliferation of online gambling. It used to be, and I think this is the other thing, it used to be that for somebody to engage in gambling at any kind of a higher stakes sort of level or with that kind of regularity, you had to go somewhere, you had to engage publicly. Like, so you're traveling to Vegas, or you're going to Shreveport, or you're going to the riverboat or whatever. And so there's a kind of a different kind of public aspect of what's happening in this, and now it can happen completely in the privacy of your own home. Nobody sees, nobody knows, and so you get this just proliferation of online gambling. And I think that's where you see then the proliferation of addiction. And in some ways, the church may be kind of behind in recognizing just how prevalent this is becoming, just how widespread it was becoming. Whereas we maybe could sort of turn a blind eye. It's like, well, that's just something that happens sort of over there to other people. And it's like, no, now more and more, this is so widespread.
I think a couple of things I thought about is, to your point, it's become so normalized in our culture that it can feel countercultural to say something against it. So there's some fear maybe in that. I also think there's something to. I've been doing some like reading around the 12 steps and recovery and things like that, and there's something to. I think in a lot of our churches today, following Jesus has in some ways become a preference rather than a desperate need. And if you have an addiction like this, you have a desperate need. So you at least can recognize that. I think that's where like our friends in recovery have it so right, and where we have the church has a lot to learn from those in recovery, in that they recognize I need God desperately. And I think sometimes we miss that because it's just kind of like, this is what we do.
So what if someone's listening and they have a friend or a family member that is really struggling in this area?
Yeah.
What would you advise them?
So first of all, I would say, move towards them in compassion and not condemnation. Again, we talked about this a few times. It's not just this external behavior. There's something going on in their hearts that they're looking to this thing to give them what only God can give them.
Yep.
And so when I think about the grace that God has shown me, how can I show that to someone else? Because I'm not that different than them. So moving towards them with compassion and not condemnation. I think also thinking about how do you speak the truth in love? Gospel love is kind. It's also honest. And addiction thrives in secrecy. And so if we can name that and bring that into the light, you are loving them well. And I think there is something to naming that in loving ways. And then thirdly, setting healthy boundaries that, it's not loving to enable someone in that kind of behavior. You're actually not helping them, you're hurting them. So how do you set healthy boundaries? If in the case of gambling, maybe they're looking to you to borrow money or whatever it is, some kind of financial dependence, like how do you actually set some good boundaries? And then I would also say, if, depending on their addiction and where they're at, there's so much of this that is probably outside the realm of our expertise. And so getting them the help that they need, whether that's recovery, a counselor, a therapist, how do we get them the kind of professional help that they're looking for, that they're really needing? And I think finally, I would just say to keep praying and to not to give up, that I can't change someone's heart, but I know God can. I know God can transform people's hearts, and that Jesus is in the business of making all things new. And so trusting in that. There's that quote by Thomas Chalmers, who's this Scottish preacher from the 1800s. I always think about that when I think about, because addiction is idolatry. That's not what the scriptures talk about. You can't dispossess the heart of an old affection, right? Without the power of an expulsive power of a new one. Expulsive power of a new one.
Look at y'all nerding
That's what this is about, right? It's the expulsive power of, they're looking to this thing to find the life and the joy and the satisfaction that only God can give them. That's an invitation, right? That's gospel freedom.
Yeah, it's really good. Yeah, I mean, I think we have to recognize with any addictive behavior, whether it be gambling or it be alcohol or on and on and on the list could go, we oftentimes think the addictive behavior is the problem, when in reality, it's often an attempt at a solution to a much deeper problem, right?
Yes.
I am looking to this to try to help meet a deeper need.
Yeah.
And so even as we're thinking about our own behavior or accompanying others, recognize what is the deeper need that's here, right? That this has become an attempted solution to a deeper problem. This is what I reach for to help me feel some sense of hope or identity or comfort or, right? And so what's the deeper issue, the deeper need? I think about, we talked about as a staff just a couple of weeks ago as we were coming to the table of communion together, the words from Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 13, the Lord is speaking through the prophet. And he says, 2 sins my people have committed. They have forgotten me, the fountain of living water, and they have dug cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that can't hold water. And that's, what you were getting at is just this idea that we all have this deep thirst within, and we all wind up going to other things to try to satisfy that ultimately only God himself can satisfy. And so there's a part of this that I think just involves some recognition of some of the deeper dynamics and realities with regard to addictive behavior. But I just reiterate everything that Sissy said. Like, you begin from that place of compassion. You speak the truth in love. And how do you balance that, full of grace, full of truth? and then oftentimes recognizing this person really does need help, a help beyond what I'm able to provide, help them find the help that they need. We have a recovery program at IBC that is really great at just creating a community of fellow strugglers. And that person's struggle may not be the same as my struggle, but we're going to struggle together honestly in community to try to find some healing and some transformation together from some of these patterns that we can find ourselves stuck in.
Yeah, one of the books that Jason, who's over our recovery ministry here at the church, is Breathing Underwater, Richard Rohr, and I would just suggest that book. It's a shorter book. If you want to, obviously, if the person that is willing to read the book, that would be awesome. But even yourself, and just to understand kind of more of like where they're coming from and what that path to healing could be.
Yeah, and John Ortberg has just released a new book. I haven't
started.
gotten my hands on it yet, but it's called Steps, and it actually is a kind of Christian spirituality through the 12 steps. And like I said, I haven't read it yet, but I love the things that Ortberg has done. And it's really great.
Yeah. And I think that's what's important to recognize. Like, that's been really helpful to me. We all have unhealthy ways of managing pain and fear. And I might look to one thing and you might look to another thing, and it may not be something like as pervasive or as alcohol or gambling, but I have a thing, right? Whether that's like, there are some addictions that are applauded, like workaholism is you get rewarded for that, but that is also, I'm looking to that thing to give me something that only God can give me. And so that's where I think having that kind of compassion and grace is so important, because we're all struggling, and it's just different for each one of us.
And this is a subject that continues to just get younger and younger. I think that's one of the things that's like shocked me over the past, 5 years, coming out of youth ministry, and even for Michael and myself, of the amount of students that we had that got into college that came back and met with us and showed us the apps that they're on, and how much they've blown through some parents' money. And it's like, I don't know, like, I don't know how to stop it. Like, it's just like part of my human nature now, and stuff that they don't even like, horse racing. It's like they have but they're just all in and just like hooked on it. And
well, what's so crazy is like, so I used to have to go to Vegas every year for a client, and we'd stay in the casinos, and it'd be like, I'd get up at 8:00 to go to work, and people are there all night gambling. And they set it up in such a way where you don't know what time of day it is, right? There's no lights, there's no windows. It's always like a constant temperature. But now think about like that same casino atmosphere is available on your phone. So of course, students or a 17-year-old, 18-year-old, or whatever age, right? This is right here at my fingertips. I can do this anytime I want. It is so dangerous. And I can completely understand why, kids are coming back and they're falling into this kind of thing.
And I think I would just say, even before we kind of move toward banter, of like anybody that might be listening to this episode that might be struggling, like certainly we want to point you to a resource like Recovery that we have at our church, Celebrate Recovery, that's happening at other churches, but just to reach out to us directly, right? To reach out through our website, and we'd love to connect, be able to help provide any kind of pastoral help that somebody might need that's struggling, or maybe has a loved one that's struggling.
All right, at the end of each episode, we'll do a sharp transition here. We have some fun with it, and the question I threw at Sissy and Barry was we had in the spirit of the Super Bowl, different performances at the Super Bowl, and I was like, all right, if you could form a tandem, like who would you pick to sing the national anthem and then perform a halftime? Doesn't have to be the same person, or it could. What would be your combo?
I didn't think about the question right, and so I really just thought of one person who could do both.
Okay.
So mine would be Mary J. Blige.
Okay.
My favorite Super Bowl performance in the last few years was like 21 or 22 was after COVID, where it was like Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg.
That was amazing.
That was
I think
awesome.
50 Cent was like hanging upside
down.
down.
50 Cent was on it. Yeah, I mean, I thought Kendrick Lamar was great too.
Pastor Barry quoting Snoop Dogg.
That's what we got. That was our generation. Yeah.
Didn't you just go to a concert a while back?
I am going to Mary J on February 21st.
Again?
Nice. Amazing.
I'm pretty excited.
Amazing. All right, so if I'm getting to choose, I mean, I have 3 musical kids, so I'm putting my kids in the limelight,
there
right?
we go.
Kathleen can sing the national anthem, and the boys
could.
both have bands, so they could play at halftime. It'd be amazing. But
That's great.
I don't
Jones
know that I
family.
could get anybody else's approval on putting my kids.
It would be you,
But
Granzy.
the way you framed it was, and I
Whoever
think
you
they'd all
want.
get some new fans out of it.
Yeah,
So
they are great.
their Spotify streams might shoot up significantly if the boys' bands were performing. But
That's cool.
I don't know. Maybe though, if you want to do it, give the people what they want. Like if you put Beyonce and Taylor Swift both
I
at
was
the
gonna say
halftime show,
someone,
that'd be.
Yeah.
Someone would say Taylor Swift.
I mean, you know that I'm a
Swiftie.
unapologetic Swiftie.
You
so,
are,
Big
yeah.
Swiftie.
Yeah.
Even before it was cool, you were a Swiftie.
Well,
at
you
that.
know.
Yeah.
I enjoyed when Bruno
he was good.
Mars
Yep, that was good.
at halftime. I think he's a great performer.
I agree.
And I'll tell you something that's really grown on me is instrumental national anthems. The Mavs, back when times were good, when during the playoffs last year, they had a guy. This kind of sounds funny, but he's called the Guitar Slayer. And it kind of became like a whole thing through the playoff run. And it had the coolest presentation, but he just destroyed the anthem on his electric guitar.
Nice.
Wow.
And it was so cool. I also rock really good with like a saxophone national anthem.
Okay.
Like, there's just something about it I think is really cool. Kendrick or Drake?
Kendrick.
Okay.
What? Were you gonna say Drake?
No.
Oh.
No.
Well, you just got quiet.
Simone is on our comms team, and she's a big Drake fan. And so anytime that Drake gets destroyed again
Yes.
by Kendrick,
It was
I'll
so-
shoot a text in the group message. I'm like, hey, tough time, Simone.
Yeah.
Just power through it. And so anyway, that's really good. All right. That's another week of Form. We'll be back next Thursday.